begin with a moment of prayer. If you will share with me. God, we are so thankful for this beautiful day that you've given us. Thank you for my brothers and sisters from all over North America who are logging on for this class on the history of the National Association of the Church of God. Thank you for our association. Thank you for our church. Thank you for our confession of faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Yes, and we pray, God, that as we share, that you will give us light, that you will give us truth, that you will give us information, and that you will season our learning with your purpose, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Now, before we go any further, I want to just verify that there's nobody who has a problem with us recording, right? Everybody's okay because it's recording. So I just need to know if you have an objection. I'm not sure what I can do about it, but because it's going to be recorded. It's just a matter of whether we will make this recording available or not. So seeing no objections, I'm going to go right to the presentation. And I'm hoping that everybody can see my screen if I can. That's interesting. Now I can't move the, oh, there it is. All right, here we go. So our class today is History of the National Association of the Church of God. And let me give you an overview of what our agenda is for today. The history of the National Association of the Church of God began more than 100 years ago with the vision of Elisha Wimbish. In this course, you will learn what became of his vision, why the West Middlesex camp meeting was located in the hills of Western Pennsylvania, and how it was organized to develop leaders and strengthen congregations in the Church of God and beyond. So here's a basic outline of what I want to present today. The vision, the venue, and the value. The vision is first. What was Elisha Wimbish's vision and what became of it? The venue. What is the historical significance of West Middlesex, Pennsylvania? If any of you have been, and I think most, if not all of you, have been to West Middlesex, it's a small little village tucked away in the mountains of Western Pennsylvania. What is significant about that location? Want to share some historical perspective there too. And then third, the value. What impact has the National Association of the Church of God had on congregations and leaders in and beyond the Church of God? This book is the most important resource that I have available for doing the history, understanding the history of the National Association. It was compiled by Sister Katie Davis of West Virginia. And basically, it is a collection of oral histories. That is, people telling their stories. Some of them are written, but some of them were obviously interviews where the statements that people made were recorded. And then there are just some documents and even poetry. Is there a lot of different information in this book. it was republished by Shining Light as a Shining Light publication. Let me give you that exact date. That was in 1985. So that edition that I'm showing you on the screen was published in 1985. I'm hoping that this book, and there's another book that I'll show you in a few minutes, the proceedings of the Black Caucus of 1970. Now, I've heard some conversation about us making that Church of God in Black perspective, this book, making this available. But I think both of these books, Zion's Hill at West Middlesex and Church of God in Black perspective, are books that we might want to consider making them, republishing them, reprinting them, and making them available to people who want to have the primary source documents. Now, when you're doing history academically, there are basically two kinds of documents that you deal with: primary source documents and secondary source documents. Primary source documents are basically from the source. They're the words that people spoke, the testimonies of their experience, letters that people write. Sermons are primary source documents. But secondary source documents are what people write about events and about other people. So we're going to use both primary and secondary source documents for our presentation. Like, for instance, I've done a book, Saints in Exile, that I'm going to reference. That's a secondary source document because I have used primary sources in presenting my ideas and my analysis. The single most important book on our history, I would say, is Dr. James Earl Massey's book on African Americans in the Church of God. So we're going to use both primary and secondary source documents, but you will see in a moment, while this one book, Zion's Hill at West Middlesex, is the most important primary source document that we have of the origins of the National Association and of the West Middlesex camp meeting. It inspires me reading this book that was compiled by Katie Davis to ask myself the question, in our own time, how well are we collecting data? How well are we collecting oral histories? Are we documenting where we are now as we look back and give so much value to what was documented at the beginning? We also want to keep in mind the importance of continuing to document our journey as we go forward. So let me share with you a couple of, I'm just gonna read a couple of pages from this book so that you can hear why I'm giving it so much importance. What I'm going to share with you is Priscilla Wimbish's testimony. Priscilla and Elisha Wimbish were the couple. She was a minister. He was not a minister, but he was the one with the vision, and her testimony is recorded in this book, and she gives an account of how she and her husband came to West Middlesex. And I want you to listen to this because this is a place where we don't always have the straight information about who had the vision and how did they implement it from the beginning. That's why I'm starting with vision, because vision is very important. This whole experience that we have is still the outworking of vision. So I'm on page 10 of Zion's Hill at West Middlesex. And this is the testimony of Sister Wimbish, what she wrote September 30th, 1941 in Youngstown, Ohio. Okay, so we're going back, how many years is that? 80 years? 1941. This was Sister Wimbish's testimony. I'm going to try to give the history of the West Middlesex campgrounds. About 39 years ago, I met Brother E.W. Wimbish, and we began a courtship. It was then that he told me about his vision of such a place as we have now. Okay, I just want to stop right there. She said 39 years ago, and she's relating it to her marriage. She was not married yet, and he already had the vision. And while they were courting, as they say, he shared the vision with her. 39 years. So that means the vision goes back to 1902. Why is that important? Well, we'll just take note of it, and I'll show you why that's important later on. 1902, okay? So, told me about his vision. We were living in Cleveland, Ohio at the time. And I remember one Sunday he took me to Sharon, Pennsylvania, which was my first time in Pennsylvania. He left me at his nephew's house, took his nephew's son, and went for a walk out the road looking for the place he saw in his vision. He went to the woods, but he didn't see any running water, nor water bubbling from springs. The hills, the trees, and lower lands were not the scene of his vision. His picture was of crowds and crowds of real happy people having church out in the woods, where there were beautiful buildings among the trees, which amazed him with its wondrous beauty. His vision rested on his mind, and every time he had a chance to go to the woods, he would look for the place. We went back to Cleveland that Sunday, and about 2 weeks later, we were united in marriage and moved to Sharon. We were Baptists and joined that church after moving to Sharon and did what we could for the Lord. We saw the need of a closer walk with God. So we started a little prayer band and called it the Brothers and Sisters of Love. Those who wanted more of God in their lives became members of the prayer band. We earnestly prayed and studied our Bibles. God revealed the light of his word to us, saved and sanctified us. God spoke to me later and said, "Come out." I did not know what the voice meant, but I obeyed and came out with about 7 who followed me. We continued our services in homes and on the streets. I know this was of God because souls were saved, and with his help, we built a meeting house where the present Church of God now stands. The Sisters and Brothers of Love had no church name and no other church connection. We had never heard of this movement we now know as the Church of God. So I want to make sure that you hear this sequence. Her intended, she wasn't even married to him yet. Brother Wimbish had a vision. He took her to Sharon, and she saw him diligently looking for the thing that the Lord had shown him in the vision. They got married, they moved to Sharon. They left the Baptist church, but they started a prayer band, Brothers and Sisters of Love. But all of this time, they had never heard of Church of God. The Lord blessed us, blessed our worship and our little meeting. Souls were saved, sanctified. We felt the need of someone to do the baptizing. A brother Ramsey knew the saints and put us in touch with Brother Johnny Williams, who was the first Church of God minister we ever met. He came and did the baptizing for us. Brother Williams told Brother Grant Anderson about us, who later came to the Slavish saints and then over to our place. You know, the Slavs are Polish. Okay, these are European immigrants. And we'll talk about the immigration to this area, but these were immigrants. Our hearts did rejoice at the preaching of God's word. Brother Anderson went from us to the Emlenton camp meeting. Now, let me just pause there. Those of you who don't know, the Emlenton camp meeting, let me see if I can say this. If you know where Route 80, West Middlesex is near the intersection of Route 80 and 60, let's say 60. If you go east on Route 80, if you go west, you go to Ohio. If you go east, you get to, like if you're going toward Grove City, you get to Route 79, which goes north and south from Pittsburgh, right? If you keep going, go through Mercer on Route 80, and you go east past 79, about the same distance as from West Middlesex to 79, you get to Emlenton. So I'm just trying to describe to you, Emlenton is what, maybe a 45-minute drive, 45 minutes to an hour drive. It's very close to West Middlesex, but that campground and that camp meeting was already established. So Emlenton camp meeting, he met Brother R.J. Smith, who had just left Freeport, New York, to pastor a few saints in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Brother Anderson told him of a group of people who had accepted and were standing out for the whole truth of the Bible and had also built a meeting house. Now, let me go down to Brother Christmas. Brother J.A. Christmas. I'm still reading. This is still Sister Wimbish's written statement, okay? Went out hunting one day, and he came back. He told Brother Wimbish he saw a place in the woods of West Middlesex, which reminded him of the place in the dream which the Lord had shown him and which he had often mentioned. Brother Wimbish went to see it and said, yes, this is the place. That place is the present location of our West Middlesex campground. Everybody was so happy that the land had been located. So the brethren began to investigate the ownership, make plans, and secure means to purchase the property. God blessed their efforts, and we obtained the land. Now, the next thing was to get ready for our first camp meeting. My husband gave up his job. Okay, y'all don't gloss over that. He gave up his job and went out to take care of the place. We had our first meeting in the old apple orchard. Praise God, what a glorious time we had. Saints who had heard of our expected meeting came from far and near. We used the old farmhouse, which was already on the farm, for sleeping quarters for the women, and the men slept in the barn on piles of straw with weeds and briars sticking them during the night, and all signs of it on their clothes the next day. But everybody was happy and praised God for such a place to worship. Our camp outgrew itself the first year, and the saints from other places took hold. The next year, our meeting was not down on the farm, but in the location where we are now, although not the beautiful, valuable buildings which you see now. She's writing this in 1941. The brethren did plenty of hard work, felling trees and clearing a place for our first tabernacle, which was made out of wood of the old-fashioned kind. They built a dining hall and kitchen, and also a few little cottages were built on what we call Smith Avenue. And that might be what we know now as Smith Court, I'm not sure. These buildings were crude and simple, but we didn't think so. We were as happy as if we had built mansions. We felt so good. Shouts could be heard all over the place. There was much hard work, but we were happy. The women did what they could, helping the men. There were ticks to fill with hay and be carried, meals to cook on homemade stoves or old stoves out of doors, fires to make which wouldn't burn even after we coaxed them with old grease and skins. We had no place to put things. What a time we had with those old dishes and cook vessels and scrubbing those rusty knives and forks with sand and singing and praising God as we did it. Brother R.J. Smith was our spiritual leader. And so we made him our first president. Things progressed nicely as the years moved on. A mortgage had been made on the place, and Dr. Marshall gave us notice of foreclosure, saying that he could no longer wait on his $1,700. We were alarmed at the thought of losing our campgrounds, including the money and labor of love we had put there. Times were not so good then, and money not easy to get, especially that much. Brother Smith and some of the trustees came to our house to see husband, she's talking about Elisha, and me about a plan they had to raise the $1,700. They asked us if we would get a mortgage on the home we were living in, Sharon, and let them have the money, which they would repay us later. Brother Wimbish readily agreed, but I had another thought. It came to me that we could sell the home, which we did. We made a donation of $1,000 on the mortgage and told the brethren we would loan them $700, which they could pay us back over a period of time. They were so happy, they said they would build me a lifetime home on the spot I choose for saving the campground. I'm glad I did it. I have seen many people helped, many souls saved and made happy, which makes me rejoice to know that I was obedient to the voice of God, an instrument in his hands for the work of his kingdom. Now, I know that's a long thing that I read, but I want you to get the story because she basically talks about the vision, and people love to talk about vision, but vision requires sacrifice and give the financial sacrifice that the Wimbishes made. He gave up his job. They sold their house. They bailed them out when the mortgage was due and they were about to be foreclosed. But most of her words are not complaining. Her words are, we were happy, we were happy, we were happy, because we know we were doing the will of God. And so her story is such an inspiration because these are Black people at the beginning of 20th century. They didn't have much. They didn't have much margin, but they lived sacrificially. It reminds me of the parable where the two parables, the pearl of great price and the parable where the man finds the treasure and he sells everything he has to buy the land because it's got a treasure on it. Well, they sold everything they had because this was the vision that God had given them. Now, I want to also share with you the details of the vision. And I get that from same book, Zion's Hill, but this is the testimony of Jerry Luck. And Brother Luck was the nephew of Elisha Wimbish. So Brother Luck's testimony will tell you what the vision is. Now, I think this one is an oral history that was recorded in the book, but these are the words of Brother Jerry Luck. I believe I'm the oldest one of the 5 living members of a religious group who chose the name of Brothers and Sisters of Love, which grew into the congregation now known as the Church of God, located on Cedar Avenue in Sharon, Pennsylvania. The church in Sharon was the beginning of the meetings on the hills in West Middlesex, which is the fulfilling of a vision seen by my uncle, E.W. Wimbish, several years before while he was living in Cleveland. He told many times and to many people of a very large place on a hill and the people of God gathering from far and near to worship God in spirit and in truth. He also saw a part was lower farmland with a large house to shelter the saints in time of famine. And there was a cemetery to bury the old and the poor saints as they pass on from labor to reward. So those are the components of the vision that I want to put before you. A large place on a hill, people coming from far and near, a place to shelter the saints in time of famine. There was in that vision, there were people living there, not just coming to worship. It wasn't just about worship. It was also, may I just say, there was a prophetic element in the vision of preparation for hard times. And then also a cemetery. And you may have heard, I haven't found the cemetery yet, but I'm hoping at some point to resume my search. I have been given some indication of where that cemetery might be, but I need to, or at least if I'm the one who's going to look for it, I had to look for it when there's no mosquitoes. So I had to wait for the cold weather, because when I tried to look for it in the summertime during the camp meeting, the mosquitoes ate me alive. But there is reportedly a cemetery on the grounds, and but the house to shelter the saints in time of famine, I'm not sure that was ever done. The venue, why West Middlesex, Pennsylvania? I've already read you, Brother Chrisman was hunting. He came upon a place that Brother Wimbish had testified so many times that everybody knew it. And when Brother Chrisman showed Brother Wimbish the site, he said, this is the place. What do you have in West Middlesex? Well, I got 2 more books I want to show you that are more picture than history. But you ever heard the expression of 1 picture is worth 1,000 words? Mm-hmm. Well, these 2 books, one is titled African Americans in Mercer County, and the other one is Farrell. Let me see if I have a slide. I think I have a slide. There it is. These are the 2 books Roland Barksdale Hall has compiled, but they're mostly pictures. It's mostly pictures in these books. And some of them, I mean, they're not just people in the Church of God. The African Americans in Mercer County book obviously has people from different churches and organizations, but basically it's giving a pictorial history of African Americans in the region. And then the Farrell book is not just the African Americans, but the other, let's call them ethnic groups. Because of the steel industry and the tin industry, they drew communities of immigrant populations, European immigrants, and African Americans who migrated from the South were in concentrated in this area. And so in these two books, there's a lot of pictorial history, not a whole lot of words, but documentation of the history of the region. And those books are pretty recently published, 2009, I'm sorry, and 2012, respectively, for those two books. Here's just an overview of, and this is my summary of reasons why West Middlesex was a special location for the fulfillment of this vision. I mean, I can't tell you, but this is the reason why God told Brother Wimbish to go to West Middlesex. I can't say that. All I can do is give you some perspective on why this region has been attractive as a place for the origination and the sustaining of the National Association of Church of God. Number one is a legacy of hospitality. As you know, or I hope you know, but although this reading of history, I suppose, is currently being contested, there is a history of slavery and racial oppression in the United States of America, as experienced by African-American people, whether other people want to talk about it or not. And refugees from slavery, when slavery was in effect, Pennsylvania was one of the states where people escaped to Pennsylvania. People escaped to Ohio. Sometimes they went through Pennsylvania to Canada. And so Mercer County was a station in the historic Underground Railroad. So people who were escaping racial oppression in the South would, by foot. Railroad is not a railroad track with an engine and a locomotive. It's people by foot, sometimes traveling under the cover of darkness. And of course, you go to the whole history of the Fugitive Slave Act, where there were legal means for people to be recaptured, which also, if you saw the film a few years ago, 12 Years a Slave, is a story of a free Black man who was illegally kidnapped and sold into slavery. So these are the kinds of things that were going on in the United States in the 19th century. During the 1800s, Mercer County was a station in the historic Underground Railroad. African-American migrants from the South settled in Sharon and Farrell, seeking employment in the tin and the steel mills. And so, I mean, people go where they can get jobs. And these were well-paying jobs. They were skilled positions, but there was an openness to allowing African-Americans. There's some places where the best jobs, African-Americans couldn't get them. But as these industries were growing, when you're growing, you're going to accept the people who have the skills and ability to do the job. And so among them were African Americans. There were also strong families of entrepreneurs. That is, entrepreneurs are people who have their own idea about starting a business, they run their own businesses and organizations. Inventors, visionaries, people who they're not just content to work for somebody else or to buy into somebody else's project, but there were strong families of entrepreneurs, inventors, and visionaries who inspired and organized each other to buy into Elisha Wimbish's dream. And so it wasn't one person by himself. It wasn't just Elisha and Priscilla Wimbish by themselves, but others bought into the vision. And they were in a region where people were accustomed to, shall we say, embracing the struggle and the aspirations of African-American people in general. What became of Brother Wimbish's vision? First camp meeting was held in 1917. So if you, I told you the date, 1902 was a date that Sister Wimbish associates with her husband telling her of his vision. So it took about 15 years for the vision to come to fulfillment, with a crowd of 600 people attending on the final Sunday. Then as now, the last Sunday is the measure of the attendance of the camp meeting. The most people come on the final Sunday. The organization was first called the Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio Campground Association in 1917. The name was changed to NACOG, National Association of Church of God, in 1943. The property, now these numbers may not be quite up to date, and some of you, if you know that what the updated property values are, I'm welcome you to share that. But the latest information I have, property is now valued at $3.2 million. This is the same property that was going to be foreclosed for $1,700 when the Wimbishes sold their home. It's now valued at $3.2 million. There are 3 dormitories, a tabernacle, 100 permanent and private residences, administrative, conference and dining facilities, concession stands, campsites, and privately owned and operated utilities for providing electricity, water, and sewage. That's what became of Brother Wimbish's vision. What is the value and impact of the National Association of Church of God? This is, to me, a very important question. And I also welcome you to add to the list of things that I have presented on this slide. The value, leadership development. When I was reading you Sister Wimbish's story, that's exhibit A of how you lead. You lead by vision, you lead by sacrifice, you lead by accentuating the positive, you lead by getting people to buy in to the thing that God has shown you, and you lead by being obedient to the fulfillment of the kingdom, advancement of the kingdom of God. Her testimony shows us what leadership development is. And so there have been many others in the National Association who, by their preaching, by their example, by their teaching, by their work, by their sacrifice, have exhibited and exemplified leadership and have encouraged and mentored others to become effective leaders. Preaching, of course, is the centerpiece of our worship, of our camp meeting. It's all about, well, who's going to preach it? Who's going to preach on this Sunday? Who's going to preach on the second Sunday? And who's going to preach on Wednesday? And who's going to preach? But preaching is very important. And preaching, there's some people who get their popularity is established by their effectiveness in preaching at West Middlesex. Because you preach at West Middlesex, you get it's a very special audience. And there's some preachers who have opportunity to preach a lot of other places, but there's something very special about the opportunity to preach on Zion's Hill. And there's a way that people come with an anticipation of preaching that makes a big difference. When any of you who are preachers know that when you rise to preach, you don't know exactly how the people are going to respond, but it makes a difference if you are in a setting where the people are responsive and ready and welcoming of the preached word. Worship and music, same thing. Our best musicians and singers and instrumentalists and people who are up and coming and people who've been serving for a long period of time. We have intergenerational, wonderful experiences over the years of worship and music, which makes camp meeting exciting. Christian education and in-service training. We have had, well, I'll get to the Dr. Massey's history, but this has been over time an important component of the National Association. Right now, our in-service training is not on the level that it was a few years ago, but Christian education and in-service training has been an important thing that brings us together as an association and holds us together, particularly the things that are done, well, not only the things that are done during the camp meeting, but the other educational ministries that have been spawned from the National Association, like the In-Service Training Institute, which had about a 50-year run. Age-specific programs for children, youth, and seniors, and that also includes age-specific facilities that we have on the campground for different age groups. Missions, there's a whole separate history that we could describe for missions, but the campground, the National Association, I'm sorry, in its earlier years had a particular organized focus on foreign missions. And in more recent years, there's been I'll just say a merger of the foreign missions emphasis with the general agencies at Anderson. But still, there are many of our pastors and congregations in the National Association who maintain a focus and an investment in foreign missions. Even if not sponsored officially by National Association, we still have that as an emphasis. And then mass communications, social networking. I put those two together because before there was social media, we had Shining Light, and we had a regular publication. We published books. We kept people informed by sending them documents and pictures and periodicals. And then in this century, our emphasis is more on website, email, social media, Facebook, Twitter, but we are challenged, yes, to stay current in terms of, or stay up to date in terms of the means of sharing information. But nevertheless, the National Association has had an impact because of the willingness and the ability of our members to use all the media available of mass communication and social networking to promote our message. This book, African Americans and the Church of God, Aspects of a Social History, Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, I'm sorry, by Dr. James Earl Massey, is probably the single best source of the overall history of the National Association, okay? Dr. Massey was a great leader in the National Association as a pastor. He pastored in the United States, he pastored in Jamaica. He was dean of the School of Theology at Anderson. He was dean of the chapel at Tuskegee, and he was a celebrated scholar of the New Testament. I don't know how many people are aware, but one of the best multi-volume commentaries, the New Interpreter's Bible, Dr. Massey wrote the introduction to the New Testament, and he was a prolific biblical scholar. He wrote on biblical scholarship and also on preaching, but he wrote this book as a history of the National Association of the Church of God, the title African Americans. So if there's one book that you can get, this is the book that I would recommend that will give you the names, the pictures, the account, the timeline. This is the best secondary, okay? Now he references a lot of the primary sources, but this is the best of the secondary sources. Now, I'm not crazy about the cover. I never have liked the cover of this book. However, that's just my opinion, doesn't matter. You see that picture there? The picture is significant because it's a picture of ministers, okay? I don't know exactly where the picture is taken, and now that I say that, let me just see if there's a reference in the book to exactly where that picture was taken. No, I don't know, but
Sister Cheryl?
yeah,
That's Old Main in Anderson.
that's in Anderson.
Yeah, that's Old Main and Anderson before, you know, that building was redone.
Okay.
Where the current Decker Hall was the main building that all Anderson activity, the university, everything was housed in that single place.
Okay, thank you. So we know that's Anderson, but obviously those are the Black ministers, right?
Yes.
Everybody in that picture is Black. And I just want you to see the mix of men and women, okay? Because in the old days, we had a lot more women ministers, it seems, than we do now. And the women have on those white blouses. Now, it might be that they're not ministers, but I think they are. And I see Dr. Susie Stanley nodding. Susie, would you say this is a picture of ministers?
No.
No?
I think even most of the ministers in the South were women that founded churches in their homes and then went on to have buildings to be the Church of God. So I think the women actually were the basis for many of the congregations nationally.
Okay. So the women were especially prominent. Say it again?
I didn't know you saw me shaking my head.
Oh, okay. But so whoever these people are, maybe they're not ministers, but they look like ministers to me. And this is Anderson. And so the other point is, if this picture is taken at Anderson, it's a picture's worth 1,000 words. Black people are at Anderson. They're there, and they're there in numbers, okay? And so we don't know all the details of this picture, but it places them in keeping with the title, African Americans and the Church of God, Anderson, Indiana. So it's an appropriate picture for the cover of African Americans at Anderson, Indiana. Now, I do have a timeline. We can't, and I'm mindful of the time. And if you need to take a break, just take a break, because I'm not going to take a break. Make sure that we use our time. But if you need to take a break, feel free to do so. And also feel free to interrupt if you have questions or points of that. I'm okay. I don't have a problem with answering questions, or if you want to share insights. But I want to just give you just some highlights. This is a timeline from Dr. Massey's book of just some events and a sequence of events that I think is important and helpful for us in our overview of the history. 1901, Brother Wimbish began sharing his vision. I've already discussed that. 1913, the Brothers and Sisters of Love established the Church of God congregation in Sharon, Pennsylvania. And that first pastor is Brother Blackburn. William Blackburn is the first pastor of the Church of God in Sharon. 1917, Elisha and Priscilla Wimbish purchased a 127-acre farm for $5,500. That was the total cost. That's the property that had the $1,700 mortgage that had to be paid. The first camp meeting was held in 1917. 1932, The Shining Light Survey, that was a periodical, begins publication in Akron, Ohio by Brother Theodore Wilson. It was later published by Brother Evans Marshall in New York, and then later published by Brother Wilfred Jordan in Anderson, okay? The 1938 National Inspirational Youth Convention, that's a convention and an organization that we have sustained over the years, obviously for our youth. 1949, the West Middlesex Youth Camp begins. So that's the camping experience that we give our young people on at West Middlesex, 1949. 1954, National Ushers Convention begins. 1957, In-Service Training Institute begins in Baltimore, Maryland. I need to say a word about that because one of the leaders of the In-Service Training Institute was Dr. Pansy Brown, who was a member of Third Street Church. And the institute was begun in Baltimore with the cooperation of Brother I don't know why I can't call his name.
Is that Monroe Street?
Scott, Brother Scott.
Yeah, Monroe Street.
Yeah,
Monroe Street, yeah. But it was actually the institute was housed at a lawyer's office. And I don't know that there are lots of pictures in Dr. Massey's book. I don't know if he has a picture of that institute gathering, but I do have, I have somewhere in my house a picture of institute when they were at the Knox law office. Brother Knox was a lawyer. But the In-Service Training Institute has its beginning 1957, but it's still coming out of National Association. 1970. I'm sorry. Yes.
There's a picture of that in the museum.
Okay,
good.
In
front of the Knox building.
Okay, great. And so you can see, and that picture has all of the participants, the teachers and the students, everybody who participated in the Institute. So that's one of the best things I think we've done in the National Association. Okay. 1970 is the Caucus of Black Churchmen in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm gonna say more about that later. And then again, I'm drawing these highlights from Dr. Massey's book. He has a whole section on African Americans who are leaders in the agencies of general agencies in Anderson. And he says that C.T. Boyd was the first African American to hold an agency position as a chief executive. And he was missionary board president 1972. Of course, there are many others, but this is just a timeline from the Massey book.
Dr. Cheryl, this is
yes.
Oliver. In that same book you're referencing, in the back cover, there is a picture of the Church of God ministers assembled at West Middlesex, Pennsylvania in 1920.
Yes, well, let me see. There it is. That's a picture?
Yes.
Yes. So he's got a lot of great pictures in this book. So as I said, if you can get this book, you will be very pleased to treasure it for the pictures and for his account. He has a particular way that he's organized the timeline and the emphasis and the chapters, because this has been great work that Dr. Massey has done for to give an account of the National Association. Now, there is an issue that we need to make sure that we're clear about, and that is how West Middlesex relates to Anderson. And there was an incident at Anderson, and I want to read you the primary source account of the incident, because much has been said about this incident, and we are still wrestling with the impact of that incident 100 years later, okay? And so I'm just trying, when I say set the record straight, I'm not trying to pick a fight with anybody. I'm just trying to say, let's look at the documentation that we have and then try to come to our best understanding of the chronology of race within our movement, okay? So I'll go back to Zion's Hill. If I can find it, what did I do with it? Oh, it's right here. Page 47. And this is a statement that was taken from Brother Joseph Crosswhite. And Brother Crosswhite was a very important leader, a manager for many years of the campground, because much of the infrastructure that we see now was his engineering, his design, and his construction. Because basically, Brother Crosswhite should be credited with turning the campground into a little city, okay? Now, think of it this way. When we look at the fact that we have, well, you remember the slide that I had, the impact, we have our own utilities, electricity, sewage system, water supply system, electrical system. All that stuff had to be built and designed. And it was on Brother Crosswhite's watch that all of those systems, when I say it's a little city, that's how you turn it from a campsite into a place where you have 100 houses and dormitories and tabernacle, etc. So even though I'll quickly admit there are improvements that we need to make, and there's updates and upgrades that we've had to make over the years, the basic infrastructure in terms of plumbing, electrical systems, etc., Brother Crosswhite was the one who supervised and even designed, as far as I know, that work. So Brother Crosswhite is, as campground manager, we've met, one of the dormitories, of course, is named for him, but he brought a lot of ingenuity to making the campground what it is. Now on page 47, I'm back in the Zion's Hill book. This is what Brother Crosswhite said. This is from his statement, okay? As the work of our brethren became noised abroad, many came from far and near to associate themselves with them and are still coming. Among them came Father Samuel Moore and Mother Laura Moore. I have heard her tell the following story with tears flowing down her cheeks. Some of us have been to the international camp meeting quite a number of times. We had placed it next to heaven. But the last year I was there, quite a few of our people came from the South, and we were happy. but a few of the brethren called for us to meet them. We went to the appointed place, and this is what they told us. There are too many of your people coming here. You'll hinder the whites from coming and being saved. Why don't you get a place of your own? She continued, our hearts were sad and many tears were shed, for we had no place to go. But later we heard of the meeting here, and again our hearts were made to rejoice that we had a place where we could assemble and praise God. And then this is Brother Crosswhite's commentary. I found Sister Moore to be a valiant soldier for the master, and until she died, a faithful laborer with us, who has striven these many years to keep a door open here where men can assemble and worship God together, regardless of race or color. Okay? Why that statement is important is it's a eyewitness testimony of what the African Americans were told at Anderson, where they were asked not to come. But it also establishes that the West Middlesex camp meeting was already established without any of that. It wasn't created as a result of that. And unfortunately, in some people retelling the history, they make it sound like when the Blacks left Anderson, they went and started the West Middlesex camp meeting. That's not the way it happened, okay? The West Middlesex camp meeting has its beginning with Elisha Wimbish's vision in 1901. And just keep in mind that in 1901, Elisha Wimbish had no idea of Anderson, Indiana, Church of God. He was just listening to the voice of God. Now, what Sister Moore is saying is that once they were rejected at Anderson, and by the way, there were a lot of Black people who they kept going anyway. They didn't stop. But she was saying that the West Middlesex camp meeting was a place to go once they had been rejected from Anderson, okay? Now, you will have, look on this slide, 3 other sources where this testimony is referenced. Dr. Massey's book, he cites the experience of Sister Laura Moore. I cited in my book, Saints in Exile. My Saints in Exile book is not just about the Church of God. The subtitle of this book is The Holiness Pentecostal Experience in African American Religion and Culture. So I speak about Church of God as representative of a Black holiness movement, but my discussion is a broader one. But what I'm doing is comparing the Church of God experience with other denominations, many of which did split at that time because of the racism, and they just went their separate ways. That did not happen with the Church of God. And so that's the point that I'm making in my book. And then this is another book, very important, Rufus Burrow, Making Good the Claim. And Dr. Burrow unfortunately passed away this summer, just a couple months ago. But he was professor at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. He grew up in Church of God, but he pretty much was separated himself from Church of God, but he did maintain a relationship with persons in the church. He was in my same field of ethics. And so I had conversation with him. In fact, I have an endorsement on the back of his book. But this book is about Holiness and Visible Unity in the Church of God Reformation Movement. And Dr. Rufus Burrow very carefully documents the racism that was experienced by Sister Moore. And he also talks about and documents how the church over the years has dealt with the problem of race. And so his title, Making Good the Claim, his is really a plea. He's saying, if the Church of God is going to stand for holiness and unity, they need to make the claim good by changing their practices, and particularly by addressing the problem of racism. And so this book is very carefully done, very carefully documented. I have on the screen the names of two of the Church of God historians that he also, I'll say, engages in his text. John W.V. Smith and Merle Strage are historians in the Church of God whom Rufus Burrow employs in his text, their work. So here's the testimony. This was the
I'm sorry, when was that book written? The Rufus Burrow, what year?
I think it's 2016.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very recent, 2016, yeah. And so it's available. You can get this book on Amazon. It's available. But it's a he's very thorough in his documentation, and it's more focused on the issue, the conversation and the debate over race than Dr. Massey's book is. Dr. Massey's book is basically telling our story. Burrow is documenting our struggle. Got it? So the two of them together should give you a good picture. So this is the statement. It's like, too many of y'all coming. Other white people won't come if it's too many of y'all. So why don't you go somewhere else? And what I'm saying to you is, Sister Moore, as you heard her testimony, was glad to have another place to go because it already existed. But she made a point, and please don't miss this, of saying with Brother Crosswhite, when he's saying, it wasn't like, okay, let's have a black camp meet so we could keep the white people from coming. It wasn't that. It was like, let's have a place where everybody is welcome. And there's a big difference. There's my book. And that's Third Street Church of God, by the way. And it looks like people are loitering in the front, which they are. Because we, over the years, particularly when Pastor Hines was alive, we've tried our best to minister to people in the urban environment, particularly the poor. In fact, this morning we were getting set up for a holiday giveaway at one of the recreation centers in town. So we're still trying to feed the poor. It's a little more difficult now under the pandemic conditions. We still don't have, even though our mayor just dropped the mask mandate, we're still being super careful about gathering people indoors. But our event today is outdoor event. Yes, this is a picture of our church on the cover of that book. And then this is the Burrow book. And so please take note of it. I highly recommend this book. There's a tone of bitterness in his writing, but I think it's honest and it's transparent. And we can't just say, oh, well, he's better. You know, it's like we have to deal with it if we're going to fix it. You can't do reconciliation unless you're willing to tell the truth. And unless you're willing to look honestly at the history. And so I know when I first read this manuscript, I was amazed at the level of detail. And I was like, hey, this man is so motivated to tell this story so carefully. But what I felt was that there was pain in that motivation. It's like I really want this church to make good. If we're going to say that we're about unity, then we need to be truthful about what has hindered us and what it's going to take. And so, as I said, he passed away just really a few weeks ago. But I'm very pleased to have known him and have had an opportunity to engage him in conversation around these issues. Okay, the book that I mentioned earlier, this edition was published by the Shining Light. The Proceedings of the Caucus of Black Churchmen in the Church of God, April 1970, Cleveland, Ohio. And the book was published as The Church of God in Black Perspective. And I think I'm correct in saying that there's some kind of plan underway to republish this.
Yes.
But I
Dr. Sanders,
hope we can make that happen. That's going to happen, Dr. Bailey?
Yes, it will happen.
Okay. Now, what about the Zion's Hill book? Are we considering this one too? I hope.
Yes, we will. Absolutely.
Okay. All right, let's consider both of them. Church of God in Black Perspective. Okay. 1970, we fast forward. Go through Dr. Massey's timeline. You know, we got camp meeting going, we got General Assembly, we got youth convention, youth camp, in-service training institute, missions. We got a lot of things going on Zion Hill. Zion Hill is going strong. And in the thousands for camp meetings, going strong. But 1970 is a pivotal point for Black churches, Black ministers. It's 2 years after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. I mean, you know, we have to take into consideration the ascendancy of Martin Luther King from the time of Montgomery bus boycott, 1955. By 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. There are riots that erupt all over the country. There's a day of reckoning, and there's a lot of social change that's in the air. So it's certainly not only the Church of God. In fact, Church of God ministers might have been a little late to the party. But in the late 60s, you had many similar kinds of events where Christians were coming together asking the question, what are we going to do about this problem of race? So here is a list of the ministers whose documentation is included in this book. I put in bold print the two who are still with us. And Ron Fowler actually is the editor. It wasn't, well, I say he's the editor because he's the one that wrote the introduction, but we don't exactly, you know, usually with a book, you put on the cover who the author or the editor is. Now let's give Pastor Ron Fowler credit for being the editor. And Dr. Ed Falls, as you know, still with us and very engaged. He was the first African-American to be the chief executive officer of the Church of God Anderson. And we know these names, Sethard Beverly did a lot of work in urban missions, Robert Doolin in Christian education, Marcus Morgan. Now, these were people who were just significant leaders in the National Association and whose work, whose ministry had an impact at Anderson. Marcus Morgan in Chicago, Benjamin Reed in California, and he had pastored other places as well. Tom Sawyer was very important in missions. Charles Pleasant was there in Pittsburgh, and James Earl Massey, as you know, who at the time I'm pretty sure was in Detroit at Metropolitan. And so these were some of the key leaders. The women are absent. Women are absent. I don't know that women were absent from the meeting, but they're absent from the papers. But these were people whose documents, I'm going to keep saying it, their documents are in the book. And so that's what gives us a resource. And if you read that book, I hope you will appreciate the quality of thought and reflection that our leaders were given to what was happening in the society in light of what we were preaching and teaching. Okay, so I remain challenged as a pastor to rise to their standard of social and political commentary, to speak to what is happening in the times, and also to make their demands. If they were doing what Rufus Burroughs' book was about, making good the claim, they were making a demand. If we're going to be a church of God, this is what we need the church of God to do differently. Now, John Stanley, and I acknowledge Dr. Susie Stanley, who's with us, but John passed away last year. John was actually New Testament, right?
Both.
New
Old
and say again?
Old and new.
Old and new. He was a Bible professor, but very committed to his scholarship. He wrote an important article about the Black power, the Black caucus, and racial inclusion in the Church of God. John was, I don't know the exact year, but he was the founding pastor of the Church of God in Columbia, Maryland. Do you know what year that was, Susie?
I don't know officially. I meant to look that up. I'll look that up and let you know if I can find it.
Okay, but it's in the 60s, right?
No, it would have been like 71, 72.
71, 72, okay.
Yeah, I remember 72. That's the year I remember. Yeah.
Okay, 72. That's when that church was planted, right?
Yeah, but he visited 2,300 homes before they started the church.
Wow. So he was a church planter in addition to being a biblical scholar and a pastor. But that's the church that we now know as Celebration Church. So just wanted to go on record as saying that John Stanley was very instrumental in planting that church in Columbia, Maryland. Now, this is an article that he did. It was published in 2 journals, in the Wesleyan Theological Society Journal, but it was also published in the Journal of Religious Thought at Howard University. And so he did a study of this document, these papers, okay? But he looked at what was the impact of this conference and these claims and these demands that these Black pastors made. That's what this article is about. And I want to go through these because I want to bring us historically to where we are today. Number 1, the Black caucus. He's asking, why was it successful? He's saying that, well, let me just say that there's a lot of meetings that people have that it's a nice meeting and everybody had a good time, but we just go home and then we just go back to as we were. Dr. Stanley is showing that this meeting had some impact, and here's why. Here's the reasons for success. First of all, the Black caucus knew its Black constituency was a critical mass comprising nearly 20% of the Church of God. They had a power base from which to operate. Now, let me tell you why that's important. If you compare Church of God to other holiness denominations, like maybe Church of Nazarene, okay? Church of the Nazarene doesn't have anywhere near as many African-American participants as Church of God has. So if you only have a handful, if we only had 3 people, Black people in Church of God, and trying to make these demands, it wouldn't have the same weight as having nearly 20%. Now, we don't know exactly what that percentage is now. That's one of the things that the Justice and Equity Task Force has been charged to study, is what is the demographic makeup of the Church of God as we stand. But at that point, that was the number that they were dealing with. It was a power base, represented a power base. And so the Church of God appears to be somewhat unique as having such a critical mass of African-American participants in a racially mixed denomination. Second, leaders of the Black caucus were significant pastors who commanded the respect of the Church of God. Not only did they often pastor large congregations, but some have been building relationships with white leaders that establish them as leaders of the church as a whole. The key point there to me is relationships. There are people who have invested in relationships within our group, and they're invested in relationships with others, okay? And so I'm trying to emphasize not one at the expense of the other, okay? So if you are good at relating to all these people out here and you don't relate to your own, then there's a contradiction. But if you only relate to your own, when it's time to communicate with others, you don't have a foundation for it. And so the challenge to me is, he's saying these were pastors who were respected on Zion's Hill, but they also have built relationships with people in Anderson, okay? And it's not, don't get me wrong. There's some people say, well, all we gotta do to fix this race problem, just get some better relationships. Well, that's where you start. You start with better relationships. You start with establishing a conversation, but it's not just about relationships. There's more to it than that. It's just that if we're gonna work together to fix it, in the absence of relationships, we're not gonna get anywhere. Okay, more reasons for success. Black leaders applied to the church the institutional analysis of power and negotiating strategies that they had learned in their national and local civil rights struggles. So these were ministers. It wasn't like in 1970, they said, oh, maybe we should be concerned about civil rights. They already had a concern. They already were engaged when it came to the caucus. They didn't discover the race problem in 1970 when they got off, I would say got off the plane. They probably, most of them drove to Cleveland. They didn't discover it then. They had skills, strategy, experiences in struggle that they brought to the meeting. Now, some of you were on the part of the national conversation that we had on last Saturday. And I just wanted to make a very quick comparison. The presentation that Reverend Terry Montague shared with us last Saturday in our national conversation had analysis and strategy as a focus. And so one of the things that I personally appreciated about her presentation was, it wasn't just a critique. It was, okay, here's some steps that we need to think this through. Here's some questions we need to ask. Here is a way forward. Okay, so that's what strategy does for you. So many decisions we make is by, well, this is my word for it, seat of the pants. We just, okay, just do it, just do it. Strategy means that you think about it, you ask questions, you analyze, you do SWOT. She did SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. It takes time and effort to do that. But what Dr. Stanley is saying is, we had in that 1970 gathering ministers who were experienced in thinking strategically and analytically. And that meant they had a sense of the structural dimensions of the problem. So it wasn't something, y'all remember when, I probably shouldn't give this example, but President Obama had a beer summit at the White House when Dr. Skip Gates and this had a confrontation with police officer in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Was this big problem. He said, well, let's just have a beer. Okay, beer summit, that wasn't gonna solve the problem of police violence, but it was a way. You say, oh, well, if we just fix it by a beer or a cup of coffee. Well, there are some things you can fix with a beer and cup of coffee, but racism not one of them. All right. So you need some analysis. Do your relationship, do your Starbucks. I don't know about the beer, but come to the table and share and go to lunch and have dinner, build a relationship, but don't lose sight of the importance of analysis, strategy, and experience. The Black leaders educated and brought along Blacks who initially appeared less militant on the surface. Now, militant was a word we don't use anymore, but back in the old days, a militant was a Black person who didn't grin and smile all the time. And when I say grin and smile all the time, all you had to do, like me, just put your fist in the air, you militant, all right? Or just take the smile off your face, you militant. It's a posture. Right. So there are people who are naturally very pleasant, but there are other people, especially in that time, who made a point of saying, you know, this is real serious, and we're going to take a posture. We're going to take a strong militant stance. Okay, but the word militant is a saying. Don't overplay that word. But he's saying, Dr. Stanley is saying, there were different levels or different political stances within the Black community, within the Black church, that we have to take into consideration. Everybody was not on the same level and of the same mindset as our leaders. But if you can't lead if you don't have anybody following you. Okay, so it's wonderful to have somebody who's your spokesperson, but that spokesperson has to have some rapport with the people that you're speaking on behalf of.
Mr. Shero?
Yes.
As it relates to that group that met in Cleveland, you mentioned that the women who were in leadership, there were many women that were there, and two of them were Addie Wyatt, who was nationally renowned for her work in the union world, and Willie Barrow.
Yes.
Thank you. They provided significant leadership.
Yes. My point is, they didn't get in the book. They were there, but they didn't get a document in the book. But absolutely. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Addie Wyatt got her face on the cover of Time magazine. So her influence is way beyond Church of God. And Willie Barrow, of course, was very well known for her work with Reverend Jesse Jackson. But yes, I can't imagine that the meeting didn't include women. I just can't account for why there's none of the women's documents made it into the book. I just don't know. But thanks for bringing that up. All right, more reasons for the success. The Black caucus knew there were trustworthy white leaders whom they needed and were willing to risk being dependent on them to help execute change. My word for this is allies. Allies. In any kind of struggle, you need to know who are your enemies and who are your allies. And you can't just write people off either. You can't just say, oh, they're my enemy because they're white or because they're this, because they're that. And you also sometimes don't want to be too quick to make assumptions about who your friends are. But enemies and allies are important. And so there's some of these conversations, why it's important to have the conversation is you have to see who is willing to engage in the conversation and who is not. And sometimes you will be surprised to find the people who are allies and who are willing to engage in the conversation. That's why the conversations are important. Next, 13 years of church resolutions and study commissions set the stage for the Black Caucus. Blacks usually initiated these resolutions and study commissions. These actions slowly led the church to accept most of the concerns presented by the Black Caucus in 1970. These resolutions and study commissions are pretty much at Anderson, okay? Presented at the General Assembly. Some people say, oh, resolution doesn't do anything. But when you do it constantly, you build up, you build a conversation, you build a rapport. When you have study commissions, that means that people are coming together. This is the way I feel about this. The Justice and Equity Task Force that was just voted in this past June as the General Assembly of the Church of God convened in Denver. That task force has just been named and seated. Haven't had a first meeting yet, but it's like a study commission, okay? And so rather than just say, oh, well, you have these resolutions, you have these study commissions, but you gotta study it if you're gonna fix it. And the resolution may be, even though it's just words, to have words and to have people who are seriously committed to studying the problem, it makes a difference in conjunction with the activists, okay? So some of us are better at studying than we are at protesting. And instead of fighting each other, we need to link forces so that when there's some people who are good at speaking, there's some people who are good at tearing stuff down, and there's some people who are good at doing research. And so we need to acknowledge that this problem is bigger than one solution. The solution requires multiple gifts and multiple efforts. And so that's what I see in 13 years of resolution. Oh, what good did it do? It set the tone for the work of the caucus to be implemented. Finally, the Black Caucus appealed to the message of unity and holiness central to the Church of God's origin and reason for being. The caucus pleaded for the church to implement institutionally the unity it proclaims. So that's the same thing as the making the claim, making good the claim, the same kind of language that Rufus Burrow set forth in 2016 is the language of this caucus. Please, Church of God, where's the unity? Where's the holiness? It was that message of holiness and unity that drew Blacks to the Church of God in the early decades of the movement's existence. So that takes us back, that last statement takes us back to Elisha and Priscilla Wimbish. And they're on the streets of Sharon, Pennsylvania, witnessing to people, praying for people, going in and out people's homes, trying to minister to people. And they discover, oh, there's a church that's preaching a message of holiness and unity that we can embrace. And that is an important element of the chemistry under which in Western Pennsylvania, the National Association of the Church of God came into being. Now I'm going to allow you time for Q&A, but I'm wrapping up. Where do we go from here? 2021. Okay, these just some random thoughts from me. We had our first virtual camp meeting in 2020, and we had a second one this past August. We had our first virtual GA meeting because of COVID-19 and our pandemic precautions. That was a first. And going forward, we will have to decide, are we going to just go back to in-person meeting? Will we do a combination of in-person and make it available, live stream it, or a hybrid kind of meeting? Will we make it possible for people to interact using the technology like what we're using today, using Zoom? This is, I think, a historical challenge for us. When I say challenge, I don't mean in a negative sense, but it's something that we haven't done before. But it may potentially open up a whole new world of potential interaction and dissemination of our message and our ministry beyond people who can actually physically gather at the campground at West Middlesex. The national conversation, as I mentioned last week, in response to the proposal from Pastor Robbie Davis, made a proposal to separate the National Association of the Church of God from Anderson. Where do we stand on holiness and unity? Holiness and unity consistently is the message. That's sort of like the twin pillars of the teaching of the Church of God, the distinctiveness of Church of God. So one of the things in our conversations that we all have to ask ourselves is, where do we stand on holiness and unity? And I would suggest to you that we need to be mindful of our history when we ask ourselves those questions, okay? We have to ask the question in terms of where we stand and where we're going, but we don't want to talk about holiness and unity without hearing the testimony of Elisha Wimbish, Priscilla Wimbish, Laura Moore, Joseph Crosswhite, and all of the Black caucus people, because every last one of them is bringing the church back to account on the issue of holiness and unity. And so let's incorporate our historical perspective as we ask ourselves these questions going forward. Women, now, I haven't talked a lot. We've mentioned that, as you know, I was trying to show you in that first picture, you have women and men working together, women in leadership, women pastors, women ministers, and the whole story of division is a man and a woman, a couple. They weren't even married yet, and they're sharing. Vision was part of their conversation before they ever got married. So it's an interesting portrayal of partnership between men and women, of Elisha and Priscilla Wimbish, and how he had the vision, but she was the one who was leading the evangelistic work. Women, we have, for the first time, as far as I know, in National Association, Chief Operating Development Officer was elected in August, Dr. Arnetta Bailey, and I was elected as Vice Presiding Elder. And we have not had, in terms of our structure, and we've changed the structure and certainly the titles of leadership titles over the years, but I'm not aware that we've had women serving in those particular offices in the National Association in the past. So that's something to think about, where we go from here. And then I've already mentioned the Justice and Equity Task Force that was approved by the General Assembly of the Church of God in June. And as we speak, in fact, there's still the last information I got, I did get an email just a couple of days ago with the roster of people who are on the task force. It's 7 people, but there was one person, they were still waiting for a response. I don't know who that person is, but this is a men and women, a Black, white, Hispanic, and then I don't know who the one person who hasn't responded yet is, but it will be an effort to take account of the demographics of our movement in terms of leadership, congregations, and membership. And then we will, the task force will attend to how to make racial justice and gender equality a part of our credentialing, qualifying people for credentialing, that they have to address those issues. Okay, I want to end, I guess, with a statement that Gary Agee, I think. Gary Agee is a historian. He's got a new book coming out next year on the topic of unity, but he's wrote the afterword in the Burrow book, Gary Agee, and he quotes a sermon that Dr. Sam Hines, who was my predecessor at 3rd Street and was an agent of reconciliation. Pastor Hines left us in 1995, so he's almost 27 years ago was his death. But in 1991, he preached these words at the camp meeting in Anderson. God has set a new world order. It is not racial, it is not national, it is not Jewish, it is not Gentile, it is not East or West. The Church of God is either going to demonstrate, dramatize, or display this solidarity, or become a contemporary scandal, bringing blame and shame to the gospel by virtue of blatant contradiction between what we preach and what we practice. So Dr. Hines's words, I won't say they haunt us, but they challenge us to be aware of how important our current moment is, our current conversation is. And I appreciate your patient listening to what I have presented. And I hope that this will enrich the conversation going forward so that we will appreciate our history, appreciate our struggle, and cast vision for our future. This, in case you want the exact references, this is a list of all of the sources that I have cited and consulted. The Barksdale Hall books, those are the picture books on, the series is called Images of America. And then the Burrow book, Making Good the Claim, Zion's Hill. I added Michael Emerson and Christian Smith are sociologists who have done a study of the problem of race in evangelical religion in North America. That book was written in 2001, Divided by Faith. And it's one of the best books that helps explain the persistence of racism among white evangelicals. But in that book, they acknowledge the effort that Dr. Hines and some others, Tom Skinner and other Black ministers have made to try to address the problem of race and trying to promote racial reconciliation. Curtis D. Young is another person who gets cited in Michael Emerson and Christian Smith's work. I've mentioned Church of God in Black Perspective, African Americans, Church of God, and then my books. I have another chapter in a book called Called to Minister, Empowered to Serve. That's a book about women ministers in the Church of God. It's two editions. The first edition was published in 1989. The newer edition is 2013, and Marianne Hawkins, who at the time was Dean of the School of Theology, is the editor. But I have a chapter in there on the ethics of holiness and unity in the Church of God, where I basically give more of an ethical than historical assessment of where we stand on those two issues. And then this is the citation for Dr. John Stanley's article, Black Caucus Power and Racial Inclusion in Church of God, in the Wesleyan Theological Journal. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your time. And God bless you. Share it. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you really enjoyed and learned from Dr. Sanders' presentation of the history of the National Association. Now, when you hear the names of Brother and Sister Wimbish and Brother and Sister Chrisman, you will remember how vital they were to the locating and purchasing of Zion's Hill. Please join us over the next 3 evenings for service at 7:30, and if you are a registered clergy or lay delegate, join us at 5:30 tomorrow for our General Assembly meeting. Thank you and good night.